The Russian sleep experiment, a haunting tale of science gone horribly wrong. It was 1940s Russia, in the darkest days of World War II, when the Soviet Union, desperate for an advantage in the war, turned to one of the most disturbing experiments in the history of human cruelty. The Russian sleep experiment, as it has come to be known, is a terrifying story, one that has stirred both fascination and horror for decades. Some say it is just an urban legend, while others believe it is a terrifying truth that was hidden for years. Either way, the experiment's dark legacy has raised profound ethical questions about the limits of science and the morality of human experimentation. The story begins with 5 political prisoners. These men were not soldiers or volunteers. They were enemies of the state, considered expendable in the eyes of the government. They were chosen for the experiment, not because of their abilities, but because they had no worth to the Soviet regime. They were taken from their cells and locked away in a sealed, soundproof gas chamber. There, they would serve as guinea pigs for an experiment that would test the limits of human endurance in the most brutal way imaginable. Researchers, eager to see what would happen when human beings were deprived of sleep for extended periods, subjected the prisoners to a powerful stimulant gas. The gas was designed to keep them awake for 15 consecutive days. The experiment, which initially seemed like just another clinical test, quickly descended into a horrifying nightmare. As the days passed, the prisoners' minds and bodies began to deteriorate at an alarming rate, and what was once a scientific study turned into a gruesome experiment in human suffering. At first, the 5 prisoners seemed to cope with the gas. They talked to each other, joked nervously, and even made light of their situation. They had been told the experiment would only last for 15 days, and they believed that if they could endure it, they would be set free. They held on to that hope, at least for a while. But as the days wore on, the physical and psychological toll of the experiment began to take hold. The prisoners' behavior began to change. They were no longer laughing or talking. Instead, they grew quiet, paranoid, and erratic. The gas, which was meant to keep them awake, seemed to push them further and further into madness. By day 3, the first signs of psychological damage began to emerge. The prisoners, who had once seemed so normal, now began to talk about strange things. At first, it was small talk, chit-chat about their lives, the things they had lost, the things they hoped to gain if they made it through. But by the 4th day, the conversations had taken a darker turn. They began discussing visions of shadowy figures, grotesque images that seemed to haunt them as they struggled to stay awake. They spoke of things that couldn't possibly be real, twisted nightmares manifesting in the waking world. As the days bled into each other, the atmosphere in the chamber became more and more oppressive. It wasn't just the gas that was affecting them now. It was the crushing weight of isolation, the lack of sleep, and the toll it was taking on their minds. Hallucinations set in, visions of monsters, distorted realities, and terrifying sounds that played tricks on their senses. The men were losing their grip on reality. On the 6th day, one of the prisoners began to scream. It wasn't just a cry for help. It was an eruption of terror, the kind that shakes you to your core. His mind had shattered, and in his madness, he lashed out at the others. This set off a chain reaction. Soon, every man in the chamber was either screaming or cowering in fear, unable to distinguish the horrors of the waking world from the nightmares created by their minds. And yet, the experimenters were there, watching, recording every twisted moment, fascinated by the rapid disintegration of the human psyche. By the 10th day, the prisoners' screams had subsided, but the silence that followed was far worse. They had stopped talking altogether. Their bodies were emaciated, their eyes hollow, their movements slow and labored. They barely acknowledged the researchers when spoken to. They had lost all concept of time and reality. The air in the chamber was thick with despair, the stench of decay hanging in the oppressive silence. The prisoners were now nothing but shadows of their former selves. Then, one prisoner began to speak again. This time, however, it wasn't a plea for mercy or a request for freedom. The words he spoke were chilling, disconnected from reality. His eyes were wide, unblinking, as he told the researchers that he could no longer feel his body. He spoke about hearing voices whispering to him, urging him to do unspeakable things. He had descended so far into madness that he couldn't distinguish his own thoughts from the voices tormenting him. And in a horrifying twist, the other prisoners began to respond with similar incoherent ramblings. The final days of the experiment were pure hell. The men no longer acted like people. They were hollow, broken shells of human beings, driven mad by sleep deprivation and the gas that kept them awake. They screamed, they cried, they begged for release, but nothing could stop the insanity. By day 15, the researchers were faced with a horrific decision, whether to end the experiment or to continue. The results were already clear. The men had been pushed to the breaking point, and the consequences were irreversible. When the chamber was finally opened, the sight that greeted the researchers was one of pure horror. The prisoners were barely alive, their bodies twisted and contorted in unnatural ways. Some were barely conscious, while others lay motionless, their eyes empty of life. The gas had done its work, it had broken them. They had no idea who they were, where they were, or even what they had become. The experiment ended, but the damage had been done. The surviving prisoners were rushed to medical facilities, but their bodies and minds had been so severely harmed that recovery was impossible. Some died from the trauma, while others lived on, but their minds were forever fractured. The researchers were left to confront the horrors they had unleashed. What had they learned? And was it worth the unimaginable suffering they had caused? As the years passed, the Russian sleep experiment became a dark, cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragility of the human mind and body. It serves as a stark warning about the ethical boundaries of science and the dangers of pushing human beings too far in the pursuit of knowledge. The Russian sleep experiment has become an urban legend, a terrifying story passed down through whispers and online forums. Whether it's a true account or a work of fiction, one thing is certain: the haunting memory of what happened in that sealed chamber will never be forgotten. It is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can emerge when science disregards the value of human life. So, remember this story the next time you hear of an experiment or a test conducted in the name of progress. Ask yourself, how far is too far? And are we willing to risk everything for the sake of knowledge?